Now, support for the Conservative Lib Dem coalition has fallen sharply since the general election. An ICM poll for The Guardian found 47% of people thought the two parties shouldn't have formed a government, against 43 who did. Back in May, that was 59% supporting the coalition, with only 32% in opposition. However, hoping to get a little taxpayer backing, the government has launched a crackdown on UK benefit cheats living abroad. They're hoping to halve the £66 million fraudulently claimed every year. But is it enough to win back support after damaging revelations from senior Lib Dems and yet another spending U-turn from Education Secretary Michael Gove? Well, joining me to discuss the issues, Sam Coates of The Times, and also here in the studio with me, Blogger of the Year, Richard Flowers, and author Joanne Nadler. Thanks very much indeed, all three of you, for joining us. First of all, Richard, congratulations on being Blogger of the Year. Sam Coates, first of all, as you're further away from us, what do you make of this drop in popularity for the coalition? Is it inevitable, or does it tell us something?
Well, I think in many ways it's unsurprising. This is a government that has had to embark on the biggest fiscal consolidation, the biggest cuts to public spending in a generation. I mean, you could say it's a bit of a surprise why the approval ratings for this government aren't much lower. For instance, they are cutting £81 billion out of the public purse. A lot of services, even frontline services, some of which we thought would be protected, are disappearing down the plug hole over the next 3-4 years. And yet the Tories within the coalition are still on approval ratings are still getting about 40% support. It's the Lib Dems who've been taking the hit, round about 10-11%. But really, you know, they are still net approval figures. You know, this government isn't in the red yet, and that is quite astonishing given the sort of difficult task that they faced, and in some ways the sort of difficult and some blunders that they've made in executing it.
Richard Flowers, I mean, let's start with that then. Do you think the Lib Dems have taken more of a blow on this coalition than the Tories have?
The polls seem to show that, but the polls are a snapshot of people's opinion right at this moment. If you look at the actual results in by-elections at council level across the country, we seem to be holding our own quite a lot. So really, it needs us to wait until we start getting some real election results.
Yeah, but
I know, I would
music,
say that. It's political answer, isn't it?
The mood music is of Vince Cable's blunder, of Nick Clegg suffering terrible pressures, struggling to sort of, you know, stay sane under the sort of pressure he's got, fighting rearguard action as well as trying to do battle with his partners in government.
Well, I think Nick's doing very well, actually. I mean, I've seen him in cabinet, and he's thriving on it, really. So
he is, certainly. I'm not sure about the rest of your party.
Well, you know, when we were at the conference, people went into conference feeling very nervous about the situation, about being in government with the Conservatives. But we shared that feeling with each other, and we realised actually we are stronger together. We've come.
I think that may be right, but surely the tensions within the Liberal Democrats are going to be heightened over the next year, because really there is a sort of more obvious split in the Liberal Democrats between a left and a right. I know that's a sort of crude way of putting it, whereas the striations, if you like, in the Conservative Party are a bit more sophisticated. There's more glue there to keep some people on the right into this coalition.
Do you not still think, though, Joanne, that a lot of energy is expended by both parties into keeping the coalition together, energy that would otherwise be used on government?
Now, what I think is that at the heart of the coalition, there is a very, very tight compact between the leaders of the two parties. But as you fall away below that, then obviously there are more mumblings, there's more discontent. But I think that is more noticeable in the Liberal Democrats, and perhaps for good reason, because there is real sort of policy difference between those.
The thing to think about here is that Liberal Democrats have always had a culture of discussion openly and often, you know, debate, quite vigorous debate among the parties. What we've been trying to demonstrate since the coalition formed is that actually you can work this in government as well.
I think that's right, actually.
What you've seen in the past, in both Labour for the last 13 years and the Conservatives before that, is a monolithic structure to a party where everyone has to think the same thought, and that the idea that people might have different ideas has been a split, a gaffe even. What we're trying to develop is the idea that it's actually you can be much more open about differences, about policies where we think one thing, where the Conservatives think something else. We can bring a synthesis together.
Well,
from that.
we know that's the message. I mean, Sam Coates, is this a government where ideas are floating thick and fast, or is it starting to appear a bit managerial in substance?
I mean, I think that this government is actually benefits from being able to acknowledge that all political gatherings, be it a coalition or be it the Tory or Lib Dem party, each of them are coalitions themselves, and there are differences of opinion. And so all we are seeing, in some senses, is the disagreements that happen normally in private, slightly more in public, argued over the cabinet table. And frankly, in my view, that isn't necessarily a bad thing. But we're at a point where there's a sort of fork in the road, and it's either going to go quite well for the Liberal Democrats or quite badly in the next 6 months. We've got two big staging posts. The first in early January with the Oldham East and Saddleworth by-election, where the Lib Dems really ought to win if they're to sort of boost internal party morale. And then the crunch test in May with the AV referendum, the first big round of the council, very sort of council elections that Richard's talking about, that are essential. The party is essential. It keeps up some of its standing if there isn't going to be a crisis of confidence in Nick Clegg, because as Joe says, you're right, there is a very close-knit core, this quad as it's called, of David Cameron, Danny Alexander, George Osborne and Nick Clegg making all the decisions. But it's the fears of the people who aren't bound into that very, very tight-knit centre of this coalition, which will grow louder and louder as the coalition goes on. And the question is, could everybody else in the Lib Dem party or everybody else in the Tory party who isn't part of this club then actually break it up or force it to split apart because they're unhappy with what's happening?
OK. January and May to look forward to any results on that sort of thing. What about benefit cheats? We do love benefit cheats, don't we? A lot of the papers love them. They're the source of all evil. That's the easiest savings. Go after these people, these malingerers and scroungers, and claim back what? Well, according to Lord Freud, 5 billion a year, but more accurately 33 or 66 perhaps million a year. Are they looking in the right direction to claim back money from benefit cheats, do you think, Joanne?
I mean, absolutely. If the money's being misused, then everyone has a responsibility to make sure that it isn't. But as you say, there's a slightly bigger story there, a suggestion of something around which most people can coalesce, because it seems so straightforwardly a good idea. More interestingly, I think, looking ahead, is going to be how successful Ian Duncan Smith is at bringing in his benefits reform package, which is much more controversial. And just talking about going after benefits cheats is the easiest end of that agenda, if you like.
A popularity move, perhaps.
Well, I mean, the thing to remember is that it's just half the equation. We are also, Danny Alexander announced a £900 million package to look at tax avoidance and tax evasion. So it's not just people at the bottom end, at the benefit end of the scale that we're looking at. We're looking at the higher taxpayers as well. So it is a case of saying, well,
the higher non-taxpayers.
Or non-taxpayers even. The government has to try and balance the books, I'm afraid. It's after many years of not...
You shouldn't be afraid of it. Of course the government's got to balance the books. It's our money they're spending.
It is interesting whether you go after the blue collar. So Sam Coates, what do you think of... Sam Coates, what do you think of this notion that they're going after the blue collar rather than, say, the white collar?
It is a traditional holiday story. We've seen it before. We've seen exactly this story reheated across many quiet news period. It's a good tabloid favourite. It carries a lot of favour with certain types of newspaper. I'm not sure we're really progressing or seeing very much new. There is a difficulty around welfare reform for the Liberal Democrats. This government, for all its talk of crackdowns on tax evasion, 14 billion pounds is being removed from the welfare budget, from the budget which goes in large part to many of the poorest people in the country. But tough action doesn't yet seem to have been agreed to tackle tax evasion. There's a big test for the coalition as to whether it's serious on cracking down on tax evasion, which is whether or not it introduces this thing called a general tax evasion requirement. If it does that, it is serious. If it doesn't, then it's probably not that serious.
Okay, Sam.
And so that's the big test, really, whether or not they're happy about pleasing the Lib Dem end of the coalition.
Sam Coates, thanks very much indeed. Final thought from you all then. One thing that is starting more apparent, Ed Miliband seems to be getting more and more adept in opposition. So that's something that will grow and grow throughout 2011. Briefly, do you think he's going to become more of a sort of third force to be reckoned within this coalition now?
I think he will, actually. I don't think he should be underestimated. I think anybody from either of the two coalition parties that doesn't take him seriously is being complacent. He's been very shrewd. He showed that he could win an election that few people predicted he would. I see no reason to write him off at this stage at all.
Richard?
I'd like to see him being less oppositionist. I'd like to see him bringing some ideas to the table. I know that he's put this blank sheet of paper and 2-year time spans for his policy review, but he did stand on a platform for the Labour leadership. We'd like to see some of that being implemented. I'd like to see him pushing forward with the AV campaign, which he's promised to support. And stop trying to score cheap points off the government, but you know, if you've managed to cause us to change our mind about something, say thank you, perhaps,
He may get more experience
rather than claim that we're U-turning.
He may get more experience as time goes on. Richard Flowers, Joanne Nadler, thanks very much indeed for joining us here in the studio, and also Sam Coates there at Millbank. Thank you very much indeed for joining us as well.